the spread of ideas and beliefs. As merchants and envoys trudged along the Silk Road, they carried more than material cargo. Ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic styles also journeyed thousands of miles, often transforming in the process. The Silk Road was as much a conduit of culture and knowledge as of silk and spices. This exchange reshaped the civilizations at both ends and along the middle of the route. Perhaps the most significant idea to travel the Silk Road was religion. The trade routes became pathways for faith, with missionaries, monks, and pilgrims following in the wake of commerce. Buddhism, born in India, spread to Central Asia and China, largely through Silk Road interactions. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist monks had reached the oasis city of Dunhuang on China's frontier. They helped establish temples and translate sutras, sparking interest among the Chinese. Over time, Buddhism adapted to Chinese culture, and vice versa, giving rise to distinct Chinese Buddhist schools. The famous Mogao caves of Dunhuang, filled with thousands of Buddhist murals and sculptures from the 4th to 14th centuries, stand as vivid testimony to this meeting of cultures. There, one can see in the artwork how Indian, Persian, and Chinese artistic influences blended: Indian Buddhas with Hellenistic robes, Central Asian priests with Caucasian features, Chinese donors in Silk Road attire. In one cave painting, a blue-eyed Central Asian monk instructs a group of Chinese Buddhists, symbolizing the religious transmission. The Silk Road transmission of Buddhism changed the spiritual landscape of East Asia forever. It also influenced the West indirectly. Centuries later, knowledge of Buddha would filter back to Europe by various routes, but the first bridge was the Silk Road. Islam too spread along the Silk Road, though its main vector was often via merchant communities rather than formal missionaries. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Muslim traders from Arabia and Persia began traversing Central Asia. By the 8th–10th centuries, Islam had taken root in the caravan cities of Transoxiana, Samarkand, Bukhara, and the Fergana Valley. The process was gradual, sometimes via conquest. The Battle of Talis in 751, for instance, signaled the Muslim entrance into Central Asia, but often via trade and intermarriage. As a result, most Silk Road traders coming from the West were Muslim, bringing not only their goods, but also their faith and customs. These Muslim merchants established mosques in key trade hubs and interacted with local populations. Over time, many Turkic peoples of Central Asia converted to Islam, a shift that was largely peaceful and commerce-driven. By the time of the Mongols, Islam had spread to Xinjiang, western China, where it was adopted by the Uyghur Turks and others. Even in Tang-era Chang'an, records show a community of Muslim traders from the Abbasid realm residing near the Western market, complete with mosques to perform their prayers. The Silk Road thus carried Islam to the fringes of China and later to India and Southeast Asia via its maritime extensions. This religious diffusion was often intertwined with cultural exchange. Through the Silk Road, the Islamic world also gained access to new ideas like papermaking, as mentioned, or mathematical concepts from India and China. And East Asians were introduced to aspects of Islamic science, art, and governance. For instance, by the 8th century, the Chinese court employed Persian and Arab astronomers, whose knowledge of stars and instruments enriched Chinese astronomy. The exchange was not one-directional. It was a true intellectual give and take. Other faiths journeyed as well. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of Eastern Christianity, made surprising inroads into Asia via the Silk Road. In 635 CE, during the Tang dynasty, a Nestorian monk named Alopen arrived in Chang'an from Persia. He was welcomed by the emperor, who was intrigued by this luminous religion from Da Qing Rome. The Nestorians established a church in Chang'an and translated Christian scriptures into Chinese. A famous stone stele, erected in Chang'an in 781 CE and rediscovered in the 17th century, records 150 years of early Christianity in China, praising the dissemination of the faith and even incorporating Buddhist and Taoist terminology to explain Christian concepts. Although Nestorian Christianity never became widespread in China, it did maintain communities there and across Central Asia for centuries, all sustained by Silk Road connectivity. When Marco Polo traveled in the 13th century, He noted Nestorian Christian communities in Yarkand and along the route, a legacy of those earlier missions. Manichaeism, a now extinct faith that originated in Persia, also spread eastward to China by the 7th century via Sogdian merchants. For a time, it was even recognized as a tolerated religion under the Tang. Zoroastrianism, the pre-Islamic religion of Persia, had followers among the Sogdian merchant class who settled in China. In Chang'an and Luoyang during the Tang era, there were fire temples serving the expatriate Persian Sogdian communities. Thus, Chang'an in the 8th century may have been one of the most religiously diverse cities in the world, with Buddhist monasteries, Taoist abbeys, Nestorian churches, Zoroastrian fire altars, Manichaean temples, and likely even small Jewish and Hindu enclaves, a direct result of Silk Road cosmopolitanism. Beyond religion, the Silk Road carried a broad exchange of knowledge, technology, and art. Scientific knowledge moved in all directions. Chinese innovations like paper, printing, and gunpowder profoundly affected the course of Western history after making their way along the Silk Road. We have seen how paper spread after the Battle of Talas. Gunpowder too was transmitted. The Mongols, in their invasions of the Middle East and Europe, famously used Chinese gunpowder weapons such as bombs and fire lances. By the mid-13th century, Middle Eastern alchemists had learned the formulas, and by the 14th century, gunpowder technology had reached Europe, possibly via the Silk Road or Mongol-ruled Russia. Indeed, the export of gunpowder and its refinement in Europe had an enormous impact on the political history of Europe, as it gave those who possessed it a major military advantage. The compass, another Chinese invention, likely diffused gradually to the west through both Silk Road and maritime contacts, enabling better navigation. Conversely, Western knowledge reached China. During the Islamic Golden Age, 8th, 12th centuries, the scholars of Baghdad and other centers accumulated and expanded upon knowledge from Greece, India, and Persia. Through Silk Road links, some of this knowledge seeped east. For example, Islamic astronomers and calendar makers were respected at the Yuan court in China. Persian medicine was studied by Chinese physicians. The medical sciences provide a fascinating case. The Silk Road enabled not just trade in medicinal substances like herbs and minerals, but also an exchange of medical lore. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the great 11th century Arabic medical compendium, synthesized Greco-Roman, Persian, Indian, and Chinese medical knowledge. It even mentioned Chinese remedies, for instance. Avicenna refers to a Chinese root called suk for heart palpitations. Islamic pharmacologists like Ibn al-Baytar described Chinese and Indian plant drugs that they themselves had never seen. They learned of them via traders' reports and small samples flowing through Silk Road commerce. In the opposite direction, Chinese medical texts eventually referenced treatments and herbs from India and the Middle East. Knowledge was shared and blended, resulting in more comprehensive world understandings of subjects like astronomy, geography, and medicine. Artistic styles and techniques also traverse the Silk Road with transformative effects. The travel of artistic motifs, styles, and technologies is a rich legacy of these routes. One striking example is the development of Buddhist art. Early Buddhist art in India initially did not depict the Buddha in human form, but under Greek influence in Gandhara, present-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, in the 2nd century CE, artists began sculpting anthropomorphic Buddhas with Greco-Roman stylistic features. Wavy hair, toga-like robes, classical contrapposto stance. These Greco-Buddhist artistic conventions then spread along the Silk Road to Central Asia and Western China. Many of the Buddhas in the cave temples of Kizil and Dunhuang, for instance, show stylistic elements traceable to that Gandharan influence. Over time, Chinese Buddhist art developed its own style but continued to absorb foreign elements. Chinese landscape painting, interestingly, may owe some inspiration to backgrounds seen in Central Asian Buddhist murals. By the Tang era, Chinese artists had merged indigenous landscape traditions with techniques learned from Western regions. In turn, Persian art was influenced by Chinese aesthetics. One can see, in Persian miniature paintings of the 13th, 15th centuries, background landscapes with layered mountain forms and cloud patterns, reminiscent of Chinese song paintings. This was no coincidence. Persian painters under the Ilkhanate had contact with Chinese artists at the Mongol court, and motifs flowed west. Similarly, textile patterns leapt across cultures. The fashionable Persian pearl roundel motif circles, enclosing paired animals, became all the rage in Tang Dynasty China. Tang silk weavers eagerly wove brocades with hunting scenes and grapevine scrolls in imitation of Persian imports. Chinese motifs also traveled west. Chinese dragons, phoenixes, and lotus designs appear on Sasanian Persian silks, and later on Italian brocades, testifying to a globalization of fashion in the medieval world. Technologies of art were shared too. The knowledge of making glazed ceramics with cobalt blue designs, for example, was transferred from the Islamic world, perhaps via Persia, to China, enabling the creation of the iconic blue and white Ming porcelains. Conversely, Chinese secret recipes for things like silk damask weaving and lacquer eventually became known in the West. Glass-making know-how moved east. The Chinese of the Han Dynasty had very primitive glass, but during the Tang, high-quality Middle Eastern glass made its way to China via Silk Road and maritime routes. Chinese tombs of that era contained stunning West Asian glass bowls. Chinese artisans then tried to replicate some glass techniques locally. Artisans themselves often traveled. We know of Persian potters working in China in the 14th century. The famed cobalt used in Chinese blue and white porcelain was imported from Persia. And earlier, of Central Asian musicians and dancers becoming celebrities at the Tang court, bringing new musical instruments like lutes and oboes that permanently enriched Chinese music. In the opposite direction, Chinese styles in painting and decoration filtered into Islamic art after the Mongol conquests. The Ilkhanid Persian illustrated manuscripts show dragons, clouds, and peonies clearly drawn from Chinese models, and later Ottoman and Timurid art continued this Sino-Persian synthesis. In short, the Silk Road created a vast, interconnected art world, a kind of pre-modern globalization of aesthetics. If one stands back, one can see that the arts of Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, and China all bear subtle imprints of one another, thanks to the interactions along these routes. Even the realm of language and literature felt Silk Road effects. Words for new products often spread along with the products themselves. The word silk, Latin sericum, was derived from ceres, the Chinese. The Chinese word for grape, puto, likely came from Persian. Paper, in many languages, Arabic kagaz, from Chinese guozhi, reflects the route of diffusion of papermaking. Story traditions intermingled. It's through Persian and Arab traders on the Silk Road that the fables of Aesop and stories from the Greco-Roman world found their way east, while Indian Panchatantra tales traveled west, eventually entering European literature as well. The famous story collection 1001 Nights contains tales with origins spanning from India to Central Asia. The movement of people ensured a movement of narratives and ideas. Thus, the Silk Road was a highway of the mind as well as of trade. It enabled cross-fertilization in religion, science, art, and technology on a scale not seen before. Societies that may have otherwise developed in relative isolation were continually stimulated by foreign innovations and thoughts. In this sense, the Silk Road helped pave the way for the modern interconnected world, long before the age of the internet or globalization. By the year 1400, thanks to the Silk Road, a scholar in Samarkand could be reading books that discussed Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Chinese astronomy, and Persian poetry, all in the same library. A true world heritage of knowledge was created and shared. That intellectual and cultural synergy is perhaps the Silk Road's most enduring legacy. Pax Mongolica, the golden age of the Silk Road. The 13th and 14th centuries brought a unique chapter in Silk Road history under the auspices of the Mongol Empire. After Genghis Khan's whirlwind conquest united a vast territory, his descendants established stability and order across Eurasia that in many ways piqued the Silk Road's productivity. This era of relative peace and security, often dubbed the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, allowed trade, communication, and cultural exchange to flourish on an unprecedented scale. Under Mongol rule, much of the Silk Road found itself within one political framework. By around 1279, Kublai Khan had conquered all of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. While other branches of Genghis's family ruled Central Asia, Chagatai Khanate Persia, Ilkhanate, and southern Russia, Golden Horde. The Mongols, once nomadic outsiders, soon appreciated the value of commerce and the revenue it brought. They worked to secure the trade routes and encourage movement of merchants. It is said that a maiden bearing a sack of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other unharmed, a perhaps apocryphal but telling illustration of the security they enforced. Stations with Mongol postal ponies and guards dotted the main roads, and the severe Mongol legal code deterred highway robbery fiercely. Many previously restive tribes were now subdued under the Great Khan's authority, and interkhanate warfare was, for a time, minimized. With passport tablets issued by the Khan called paidzi or geriga, favored persons like merchants and envoys could expect hospitality and assistance throughout Mongol lands. This newfound ease of transit drew merchants in droves. Trade volumes surged as the Mongols actively promoted commerce. They standardized weights and measures, introduced paper currency in some regions, and repaired infrastructure like canals and caravanserais. The Silk Road routes hummed with activity, carrying silks, spices, porcelain, precious metals, horses, furs, and countless other goods in larger quantities than ever. Eastern goods poured into Persia and beyond, so much so that Europe first became clearly aware of China's immense wealth during this period, through reports from traders and the goods arriving in Mediterranean ports. At the same time, Western and Middle Eastern items flowed east. The Mongol elites themselves fancied foreign luxuries. The great Khans employed Persian astronomers, built Islamic-style observatories in China, drank fine wines from Iran, wore Middle Eastern brocades, and staffed their administrations with multicultural talent, including Europeans like the Polos. The Mongol world empire was like a grand free trade zone spanning continents. One fascinating aspect of this period was the deliberate movement of people orchestrated by the Mongols. Skilled artisans, engineers, and scholars from one end of the empire were often relocated to the other to serve the Khans. For example, after conquering Damascus, the Mongols sent some glassmakers to work in Karakorum in Mongolia. Chinese papermakers were dispatched to Persia. Whole communities of Persian craftsmen and clerks settled in China, while Turkic and Chinese artisans were sent to rebuild cities in Persia destroyed during the conquests. This forced migration of talent unintentionally spread technology and artistic techniques faster than trade alone could have. The result was a hybridization of culture in many Mongol-ruled cities. For instance, Maraga Observatory in Persia combined knowledge from Chinese and Islamic astronomy, and Yuan dynasty painting in China shows influences of Persian and Central Asian styles. With the road secure, explorers and emissaries from far-off countries also seized the chance to venture across Asia. We have already recounted the journey of Marco Polo and his family, who likely would not have reached China without the open door of Mongol rule and the Khan's invitation. Marco Polo's contemporary, the friar William of Rubruck, marveled at the religious debates in the great Khan Munka's court and noted how Mongol princesses patronized Nestorian Christian churches alongside Buddhist temples, a reflection of Mongol religious tolerance which further eased intellectual exchange. Ibn Battuta, arriving after the empire's fragmentation had begun, still benefited from Mongol remnants that ensured relatively smooth passage to China. By sea he reached Quanzhou, and possibly overland he visited parts of Yuan China. Rabban Bar Salma, a less famous but equally intriguing traveler, was a Nestorian Christian monk from Yuan-ruled China of Turkic origin, who in 1,280 seconds made a reverse journey. He traveled from Beijing all the way to Rome and Paris as an envoy for the Mongol Khan of Persia, attempting to negotiate an East-West alliance. Bar Salma's voyage, essentially from the Far East to Europe, was only possible in the context of Mongol unity and the connected Silk Road. Though his mission failed politically, he left detailed memoirs of Europe as seen through Asian eyes, a mirror to Marco Polo's account of Asia. Such extraordinary trips underscore how under the Mongols, the Silk Road truly became a highway linking the ends of the known world. The Pax Mongolica era also had a dark side with respect to exchange, disease. The most infamous example is the Black Death, bubonic plague in the 14th century. The plague is believed to have originated in or near Mongol-dominated Central Asia, perhaps around the Tarim Basin or Himalayan foothills. And taking advantage of the increased traffic and interconnectedness, it traveled along trade routes to the Middle East and Europe. In the 1,340 plague outbreaks in Mongol camps and cities spread to caravans and along the maritime routes as well, devastating every land in their path. By 1351, the plague had ravaged the Middle East and Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population. It's telling that one of the theories for how the plague reached the West involves a Mongol siege. In 1346, the Mongols besieging the Black Sea port of Kaffa, held by Genoese traders, reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, causing an outbreak that drove the Italians to flee by ship, carrying the plague to the Mediterranean. Whether or not that account is apocryphal, it illustrates the inadvertent role of the Silk Road and Mongol pacts in spreading the pandemic. Thus, the same openness that allowed commerce and ideas to flourish also allowed pathogens to move swiftly and cause unprecedented calamity. By the late 14th century, the unity of the Mongol Empire had fractured. The four Khanates drifted apart and often warred with each other. However, for a good 100 years, the Silk Road basked in what one could truly call a golden age of exchange, protected by Mongol might. This period saw the highest volume of east-west contact before the modern age. It laid the groundwork for the great global age of exploration that would follow. Indeed, some argue that Marco Polo's tales made possible by Pax Mongolica inspired Columbus to seek a sea route to China. The Mongol era, brutal in its birth, ultimately shrank the world and demonstrated the enormous potential of an interconnected Eurasian trade system. It was a culmination of the Silk Road's mission to join far-flung peoples in a shared network of exchange. Scholars refer to core periods of intense Silk Road trade, and certainly the 13th century under Mongol rule stands out as one of them. The grandeur and cosmopolitanism recorded by figures like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta during this time attest to a Silk Road at full vigor, a vibrant artery of globalization in the medieval world.